Good evening. Thank you so much for joining us. This is our first live event in this space since the pandemic, and it is it feels good to be back in the forum. And these, for those of you, many of our first quarter IMC students don't know this, but it's been refreshed. These are brand new seats. We've restructured the place a bit, so it's actually wonderful. You are christening the forum for a live event, so thank you so much for coming and being out here for this. Following the murder of George Floyd, there were many companies that pushed out into the world lots of ads that were sort of virtue signaling, but really badly done. They were insincere and hollow. But one company, Procter & Gamble, actually managed to craft a series of very evocative and thoughtful pieces that captured the myriad emotions that were coursing through the body politic at that time. And we here in Medill, who care very much about audience connections and about diversity, equity, and inclusion, were wondering, what is going on at Procter & Gamble that they were able to seize this moment and push out messages that were so perfect for the time. And we heard that a gentleman named Damon Jones might have had something to do with that. And we said, well, how can we get him here and have a conversation about how those messages were crafted and what they mean for the company, and does the company really live those values, or is this a form of virtue signaling as well? So hopefully we will get to that in this conversation. Through some intermediaries, we reached out to him and he agreed to join us, and we're very happy to have him with us today. Our interlocutor is a colleague who I typically describe as our newest, or one of our newest faculty members, but she's actually been here over a year now, and so she's not so new anymore. She's actually a seasoned veteran, particularly when it comes to these kinds of events. Danielle Robinson-Bell is a double Northwestern alumna. She earned her bachelor's degree from Medill and an MBA from Kellogg. She went out into the world and for 15 years specialized in diversity, equity, and inclusion, working for myriad brands, an advertising agency, and in strategic communications. So we thought, who better to conduct this conversation with Mr. Jones than Danielle. So Professor Bell, I will turn it over to you. Mr. Jones, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for that. Damon, welcome.
Thank you. Great to be here.
A small tidbit of information that you left out was one of my clients for many years was Procter & Gamble. So very much a full circle moment being here in conversation with you, Damon. So let's get right into it.
Yes, let's do it.
One of the recent headlines among the trade publications was that P&G is now the world's largest advertiser. And when you think about all that P&G has in its product portfolio, everything from paper towels to baby wipes, right? You go, okay, that's what you expect from a promotion standpoint. That's what you expect P&G to be selling and promoting. And that is a priority, right, to sell those products. But you all have been doing something else, and that is putting out messages and content that delivers on really powerful messages. And so the question is, how are you able to do both? As a sophisticated marketer, one of the most sophisticated marketers, how are you able to deliver on your goals as it relates to profit, but also this other thing, these other messages?
Yeah, it's great to be with you. I think there's probably three things that guide that. But I'd start by saying, yes, we're the world's largest advertiser, but we also pioneered the field of consumer research and consumer understanding. And I think what we've learned over many years is really what is the consumer psyche of decision making, right? And if you can understand what motivates consumers to buy Tide or Pampers or Gillette or whatever brand it is, you can also, and that's fundamentally about behavior, right? What is the behavior we want them to do? Can we apply some of those same lessons to behavior when it comes to social issues? Point number one. Point number two is understanding at the root of advertising, the core of that is to bring towards, right? Beyond getting a consumer to take an action, part of what we oftentimes think about is what do we want a consumer to think, feel, or do after engaging with the brand, excuse me, or engaging with our communication. And that is a huge responsibility that we take very seriously, right? Because advertising in general, I mean, people always talk about what happens in movies and film and all that stuff, but you see more advertising than you realize on a daily basis, whether that's in your IG feed, on your Twitter feed, walking around, whatever it is. So if we get advertising right, we can help people see themselves in new and different light, and we can help them see others in new and different lights. The third component of how we think about that is speaking to consumers holistically, right? We know that, that commercial, yes, is designed to let you know and give you a reason to believe that Tide gets your whites whiter, your colors brighter, whatever it is. But also at the core of that is what are we talking about the value of clean clothes? Right, so if you think about when you watch the next Tide commercial, you will never hear anyone say it, but look at the parent's face when they see their child walk out of the door in a great outfit, right? The pride that a mother has in sending her child off, the pride that a father has, excuse me, when he's teaching his son to shape all of these moments, because we are a company that has small moments that people don't spend a lot of time thinking about. But when they go bad and when they go wrong, you think a lot about it. Think about a bad hair day. Many days you have a good hair day, you don't really think about it. But when you had a bad hair day and it happens on the day that you wanted to do X, Y, or Z, it's really memorable. So all of those things add up into us for doing the little things right, day in and day out. And we take that same application to our messages in the social space.
And so you talk about this as strategically as being a force for good and a force for growth.
Right. So, and I'll give you a little corporate language here. I won't go too deep, I promise. It's late. But we also know that doing this is good business, right? So in a world where women make the same amount of money as men, and people of color make the same amount of money as our majority counterparts, that adds over $1 trillion to the GDP around the world, right? So that's good business for us, right? And so we take equality seriously because it's good within our own walls, it's good for society, and we look at how do we take the resources, because we're already going to be advertising, right? So why not do it well, right? Why not get some extra benefit out of that, not only for ourselves, but for the world around us? And so understanding the relationship of doing good and having good business is a circular driver for us. And one of the things that you read a lot about in the investor press right now is a lot of companies engaging in ESG, which stands for environmental, social, and governance. It's essentially the investment community's way of holding companies accountable in a common framework for a variety of choices that they're making. And we've created a framework that we think applies to our business. We don't call it ESG. We actually call it citizenship, right? And it's built on a foundation of day in and day out ethics and corporate responsibility. Do you have the right policies when it comes to human rights? Are you paying your people a fair wage? All of those things, actually, when you talk to consumers about the brands that they want to buy, yes, I want to know that, again, Tide gets my clothes whiter and my colors brighter, but I want to make sure that their people aren't on social media saying, I work for Tide and they treat me like crap, right? So doing all of the little things well, day in and day out, to never give anyone a reason not to have ill will towards Tide, if you will. But then we've made some choices to say, what are the areas that we think we can make a disproportionate impact in? And those are community impact, equality and inclusion, and environmental sustainability, right? And again, You would think that a company that puts out disposable or single-use products as much as we do is like, wow, why would they be talking about that, right? Well, when you look at the impact that we're able to have on the environment, yes, we can put recycled content into our plastic bottles, that's great. But the majority of our environmental impact actually comes from the use phase of our products. So if you think about washing a load of laundry, what's the highest source of carbon emissions? Is actually the energy that it takes to heat the water in the washing machine. So if you can invent a technology that can clean well in cold water, you can actually reduce by 2/3 the carbon emissions of doing a load of laundry, washing your hair, brushing your teeth, all of the things that are water and energy intensive. If we can help consumers get better use better habits by making products that work in a variety of conditions. And oh, by the way, think about people around the world that don't have hot water to wash their clothes in, right? What's the market opportunity there, right? So what I'd say is, without giving you the corporate spiel, looking at every way to have an intersection between, yes, we want to have a good competitive business, big brands that make lots of money for our shareholders, but how do we ensure that we can do good in the process? And I can tell you, in every area of the business where we've made those short-term decisions that may have cost a little bit more, they pay out in the end if they're built on real technology and real consumer insights. So to answer your question, how do you get both? You have to be very intentional, you have to be very deliberate, but you have to know what the end is and make sure you put yourself on a path to get there.
And is that how you landed on built in, not bolted on?
Yeah, because it's fundamentally built into the strategy. And one of the things, while I'm responsible for a broad swath of our advocacy activities, the person who's responsible for the environmental footprint of Tide is also the person who's responsible for the profit and loss in the brand. Many companies have corporate social responsibility as a separate department, and I've got a corporate social responsibility department, but we look and saying, what if we, instead of having 50 people out of 100,000 people worried about corporate social responsibility, what if we had 100,000 people doing it, right? So we equip and inspire people who are working on the manufacturing line to figure out, is there a more environmentally friendly way of doing their individual task, right? And so really, that's the whole notion of build it into how you run the business so that you don't have to come back with, what Dean Whitaker said was this performative action later on because you've built up some proof points.
I always note in my classes that when it comes to equity and inclusion, it shouldn't be something over here, right? It should be how you show up to the world, whether that's you as an individual or your company, your brand, right? So now let's get into the work. This work that Dean Whitaker spoke about and that you've been involved in.
Sure. So I'll share with you guys a few elements of creative. And what I'd say is most of the campaigns I'll show you tonight are corporate brand-led, but we also have some individual brand-leds. The first one is really built on to, if you think about from an equality standpoint, we've tried to make a point of really driving a lot of work towards gender equality, towards racial equality, and for equality in the LGBTQIA community. And if we can do those, then we think we will be able to knock it out for all of our consumers. Come back to this in a minute. So I'll share with you an ad that most people won't recognize as an ad, and then I'll talk about the context afterwards. So that was Pantene's one of our hair care brands, and one of the insights at the core of that was the importance of hair for people in the trans community to be able to kind of get it right, if you will. And it didn't need to say, I get your hair straight, I get your hair curly, I get you all of that. At that moment, you believed that this was a brand that if it could stand up with this community, could also stand for me, right? So what we look to do is to have a mix, when you look at our total marketing mix, of things that let people know that they are seen, let people know that they're valued, and you combine that in with all of your product benefit messaging. But that was an incredibly power campaign. That one was 2019, I believe. And it wasn't just the fact that we did a nice creative spot. It was the community impact activations that we did. And frankly, for the fact that when you put something out there, you can imagine how people who saw the world differently might have something to say on social media. And what happens in a lot of times when you have companies that have ads that are controversial, they say, and the haters come out, I'll just be real. People say, well, thank you for your opinion. And our brand voice was, no, this is important. We're going to stand with people. We're going to go back to the trolls on Twitter. We're going to stand up and say, this is who these people are. This is what they believe. And we believe when we say we are here to serve everyone, we're here to serve everyone. And didn't do a press release out there, but the actions that the company did in that moment helped many different consumers feel and see heard. And believe it or not, the business was at a record share of success that holiday season.
It's a beautiful spot. And again, powerful and transformative, right, in a lot of ways. Pantene, did the idea start with the brand, or did it start with at a higher corporate level?
This one grew out of, it was a mix, right? We did some work with Glad a couple of years ago, and we refreshed it every year since, called, and it was really, the insight at the core of it was, there's two insights. Number one, visibility matters, right? If you look at the degree of acceptance of members of the LGBTQIA community, the more people see them, the more people understand them. If you think about just the whole process of coming out or letting in, depending on how you define that, once people know that there was something, a person in my family, one of my friends had someone who was on the spectrum, they began to open their minds to really understanding that, right, and understanding that person and understanding some of these issues. So that was, we had a prior corporate campaign. The Pantene brand later recognized the power of hair, right? And the transformative power of when your hair makes you feel really impactful. And different consumers talk about it differently. If you were to talk to many black women, they would talk about their crown, and they would talk about the freedom of expression to be able to wear your hair the way you want to wear your hair. It's powerful. So we did an effort a couple of years ago that really challenged the notion of what does professional hair look like in the workplace? Because that's not what, some people say, I want to wear braids. Well, that's not professional. Well, it can be professional. So we showed our senior people with braids in their hair, right? And so it's really all of those little things, but it's the aggregate of that. I'll share a couple more spots, I think, that are focused on the concept of race. And I'll show you 3 in a row. One was from 2017. Called The Talk, and that really provided the insight of the conversations that black parents were having with their children to prepare them for some of the realities of being black in America. The second one was called The Look. It was produced in 2019, really looking at the images of black men who, depending on a couple of studies, you could say are traditionally the most stereotyped men in media. And then the third one was a spot we did 10 days after the death of George Floyd, really as an anthem to get more people in the white community to, if you will, come off the bench and get in the game for equality. So let's take a look at those.
Who said that?
The lady at the store.
That is not a compliment.
It's an ugly, nasty word, and you are going to hear it. Nothing I can do about that. But you are not going to let that word hurt you.
Yeah, Jackie. I guess that's not you.
Okay, now, when you get pulled over, I'm a good driver. Baby, don't worry, this is not about you getting a ticket. This is about you not coming home.
I'm gonna be okay. Right? Okay.
You are not pretty for a black girl.
the call to action there was to get people to talk about the talk, because the insight in the Black community, if you go and you talk to people about the talk, people might refer to a scene from that film. And in the majority of the community, the talk, like what are you talking about, the birds and the bees? Very different reality. So when we did that, we really had three different reactions. There were people who said, thank you for seeing me, thank you for seeing my life, thank you for seeing my world. There was a middle group of people who said, damn, I didn't realize that was really happening. You've given me an insight into the world. What can I do to help? There was a third group of people who said, you're race baiting. You're dividing us. Blue lives matter. You're anti-police in that. And that campaign, we got more negative and more hate mail on it than any campaign in P&G's history, if you think about what was going on in the world in 2017. But that resolve said we are on to something, and we doubled down. We eventually did an integration on Blackish and a number of other TV shows to help people really understand the story behind it. But what we also heard was not just about, if you see all of the people in the conversation there were Black mothers having conversations with their children. And many Black men said, where are we? And so we began to go deeper into that, and that led to the next campaign that I'll show. But I make the point that in each of these, deep human understanding of what's going on and listening intently to the consumer feedback that we're getting, so that we can understand, and you guys have probably all heard, it's not what you say, it's what they hear or what they see. Understanding how different audiences perceive these messages, so that we know how they're landing. Campaigns, we followed up with a lot of community-based dialogue so that people really understood it. The art in that particular piece of creative was trying to make it authentic enough, so that Black men could say that's my experience and feel seen and heard in that moment. But at the same time that, members of the white community said, oh my gosh, do I do that? Have I ever done that? But not in a wag my finger accusatory way, right? So we actually wanted, that was edit number 43 of that, to get it exactly right. What were the moments of inflection? What was the look? Because if you think about microaggressions, how they happen every day, no one's walking you down the street, and I should say no one, calling you the N-word, right? It's all the little things, right? So how do you make them authentic so that people's minds are open after it, enough to lean in and to pause and to reflect and to think about, have I seen that? Have I done that? Did I say something? Did I not say something? And so I think that's one of the critical things that you're trying to balance when you do this work.
And so what is that process? How do you get to that from an insights and research standpoint? Are you lockstep with the insights team throughout, from inception of idea to going to air, or when it goes up on all the channels? How do you get to a spot that delivers on that level of authenticity?
3 points. Multidisciplinary research. So there are times when you send your researchers out into the field and they come back with their report, and you read the report and then you kind of go off and do something. You don't get to this kind of work unless you are sitting in a room with people understanding. And it's got to be a diverse group of people, right? So on the look, when we started that work, one of the mistakes that we made is we had an all black team who were working on it. And we were not getting it right because we didn't have the insights from the white community to say, hey, that's not authentic to me, right? And so you need to have diverse sets of rooms. Number two, you've got to create the conditions where we can talk about really. So there's a certain point where there are heated debates of, oh, well, that's not the look. And I'm like, have you ever had a black man walk in a store and got looked at like that? It's a very different thing, right? But we had to create a safe enough environment where we could have those debates, where people weren't so scared to say anything to each other that the authenticity didn't come out. So safe spaces for dialogue. And then the third thing is we did a lot of testing, and there are a number of models. You call it ACE metrics, or a number of different groups that will look at it. And it's kind of your traditional dial testing, but we do that among different groups because the moments of tension in both of the prior two ads are different for black consumers than they are for white consumers in America, right? Different looks, different moments do that. And so you need to understand, again, where they are. And the key is you want to hold people through the ad so that they get to the reveal. We did another spot a few years ago called Gillette. It was all about toxic masculinity. If you Google it, it was the most hated ad on YouTube. It was also the most liked ad too. But what people—
Bring it into my course.
You put it in your course? Okay. But what we didn't get right at that moment is, and it's interesting, the testing, we tested that and we said, when you show everyone the whole thing, they loved it, right? But the issue was most of the people who hated it never got to a minute and 37 seconds. At about 43 seconds, they were so pissed off. They thought you were coming down on them so hard, they either turned it off or they made up their mind. So we can all see into any piece of creative or a story what you want to see. So how do you hold the viewer and understand what are they feeling at what point? And so these do a good job of saying, okay, great, I'm going to stick with you long enough to get to the reveal, and then, okay, I understand. Gillette was an example of where we didn't get that right, and you saw the degree of polarization that came out. So there were a number of other things that we got wrong in that ad, but that would I say would be the main one.
Is there one more?
There's one more. And so 10 days after George Floyd, two things, I'll set this up. You asked me what gives Procter & Gamble license to have this. And I think part of it's because we've been having the conversation for a while. If you showed up last May and said, Black Lives Matter, and there was nothing in your track record that showed or could prove to me that Black Lives Matter, then I've got license to be quite skeptical of you. Our experience in this space dates back to 2014. The first campaign we did was the Always Like a Girl commercial. And basically what you see in that campaign is over time, we've been able to change what the majority of consumers think when they hear something like you throw like a girl or you run like a girl. When that program started, that was considered a bit of an insult. Now it's considered a moment of pride. Fast forward to this point, we knew we needed to do something, but we needed to get more people actively engaged and be a little bit more specific on what they could do. So I'll share with you that piece of creative.
With invited tongue, from whence does fulfillment come? And I expel from this mortal shell, we're not die for living love. Though you say
really powerful.
Thank you.
So many would have not gotten that right.
Right. But again, if you look at the words there, we try to always center the human experience. Heated debate. Do we put the words Black Lives Matter in the ad, right? And we all know when certain people see Black Lives Matter, they think one thing, and so certain people think another thing. And the insight that came out of a heated discussion of that, there was another person in the room who said, "Do you not think my life matters?" And it was like, what it led to is not about Black Lives Matter, it was our lives matter. My life matters, right? And so the line switched from Black Lives Matter to our lives matter. Coming from a Black voice, no one debated when you say, "Does my life matter?" But it's just, but again, to get to that degree of being able to get that, and that's how you get to some of those insights of the importance and the power of language. And the last two spots have no words, right? So if you think about doing this, I mean, I don't know what they teach at Medill, but like, you need to have some words in your advertising, you know? And so, you know, we practice that at P&G, so now not to have, you know, a spot with words to be able to do this in the traditional way, very, very powerful, unexpected. We also paid a lot of attention to the context of where our ads show up, because we know consumers need to be somewhat receptive to see or hear messages the first time. Again, I'll go back to the Gillette example. If the first thing you heard was, there's a terrible ad out there that's bashing men, here it is, guess what? You're going to see that in the ad, right? If you hear that there's a race baiting ad, you're going to see that. So getting the context right, looking at the programming where these films are played and shown and how they're discussed online, plays also a huge role, something that we've learned over time.
So stick with that point for a second. So the role of media, when you think of messaging and content and placement of messages, talk a little bit more about that in the work that you do.
I'll tackle it from two lenses, perhaps. One is I'll call it a media purchasing and buying standpoint, and then a journalistic approach, maybe. So starting from there, what we also knew is the story behind each of the films was incredibly important. In some of our early work, let me say this without offending any of the journalists in the room, reporters were like, "Oh, did you see the controversial race commercial, you know, that's out there?" We're like, what is controversy about a mother having a conversation with their child, right? It's a universal insight that every mother wants to give her child advice on how they're going to be successful in life, right? And so the ability, we had to be really intentional in framing the intent behind the ad. Otherwise, because if we didn't tell our story, someone else would, right? And so really spending time and also recognizing that journalists are human. They bring their own human lived experience to all of these issues. And so we had to spend a lot more time helping people understand the context. And then more on the broad media side, what I would say is, if you looked at the choice, the final spot, we premiered that on 3 programs all within a week. There was Oprah Winfrey had a special, Where Do We Go From Here? Gayle King had a special, and I don't remember what the other one was. I think it might have been something on BET that same week, but we needed to make sure that the audience was in a moment of receptivity. And so you build up enough positive momentum. So from a social media standpoint, we tried to be deliberate so that when people went and searched for the commercial, you could actually find more positive word of mouth out there talking about the topic than negative word of mouth. Again, a lesson that we learned from some prior campaigns.
So there's a course here at Medill in the IMC program that I teach called Culture and Inclusion in Marketing. And when I developed the course and I shared the development of the course with a fellow faculty member, they asked me a question, and I've never forgotten the question. And the question was quite simply, to what end, right? As in, you're going to develop this course, we're going to bring it to the students, and it's going to be, to what's the end goal here? To what effect are we, what's the effect we're looking for here? So I want to ask this question of you and this body of work that we've seen here tonight. What's the end goal here?
There's always 3 things in my answer, so I'll stick with that thing. You'll notice a little pattern here. First, we want brands and a company that people feel knows them, understands them, and acknowledges them. And we recognize that transcends product benefit. So I can quote a number of statistics. 67% of consumers are more willing to buy a brand that has a shared value. And interestingly enough, in this work, it doesn't mean that they stand up for me, but that it has a shared value. So guess what? If they're willing to stand up for the trans community, for the Black community, for the Asian community, they're willing to stand up for me, right? And so making sure that as you look at the body of evidence and people say, that's a company that understands me and I'm willing to give them a shot. Number two, it really spoke to the people that walk into the doors of P&G every day, right? And if we look at companies, employees wanting to know that their company has their back, right? No matter what happens in the world that we can't control, when you walk into the doors of our company, know that you are valued, you are respected, and you can be whoever you want to be. So it has proved a hugely motivational thing from an employee standpoint. And then the third one is I think it has put our industry in terms of advertising on a different path for them to see an industry leader like P&G being willing to tackle some of these issues. Because until you are willing to and able to talk about a problem in a constructive way, you can't begin to actually do something about it, right? So if you think about, the whole conversation on equality and inclusion isn't a new conversation. Some of the same things that people said after George Floyd was murdered were things that people have been saying for years, if not decades, right? But it takes that moment and that zeitgeist, right, to be able to do that. And we believe that we can be, again, a positive force in our industry when we look at, we're, I don't know what stock price closed at today, we're, call it, $350 billion company in market cap, round numbers, right? World's leading advertiser. Companies want to do work like this, right? And when P&G do it, I can tell you, I've been to General Mills, I've been to a lot of other companies, been to PepsiCo, and brands are now figuring out, the question isn't like if I can, but it's how can I do it? How can I do it in a way that's not performative? How can I do it in a way that is authentic? I saw some great work from McDonald's and Doritos just last week at a conference in California, right? But we sit around and we talk about the lessons that we've learned, and we've all bumped our heads in this work in different ways. But again, advertising can be a very powerful force because you are in people's homes every day. So again, helping consumers recognize the brands, and building employees and communities that value and want us to be a part of what we're doing. But then the third, being able to make a positive impact of the world. That, if you talk to any investor, that is good, positive, long-term shareholder value.
So you mentioned employees, you mentioned investors, you mentioned consumers, all key stakeholders when you think about the world of stakeholders for P&G, right?
Yep.
Right. And this work, based on this conversation, seems to be standing up as a very important tool in your toolkit when it comes to stakeholder engagement.
Yeah, it is. And one of the mindset shifts that we had to learn, and this was probably the hardest thing over the past, call it 4 or 5 years, is that agreement is not the objective. We never wanted to give people a reason to be upset at Tide. Everyone should love Tide. Everyone should love every one of our brands. And when we first got into some of this work, it was like, wow, we had never had the hate mail that we got when we're doing this, because everyone's got different contexts, and we respect all consumers, and we really do want everybody to buy Tide. But again, we have to be able to stand up when a consumer says, wow, I don't like the fact that you are doing what it is, like shut up and sell soap, if you will. We need to go back and say, hey, we believe that every consumer and every person has a right to, I can give you the full speech. People may disagree, but there's confidence in what we've seen is when you stand up for people, people may not agree, but over time, more consumers come into your franchise than leave your franchise. What we've also known is that there's times when you can insert a branded message, and there's time when you can't. We tested a number of these spots that you saw tonight and put what we call a brand carousel at the end. Procter & Gamble, the brands brought to you by Tide, Pantene, Gillette, yada, yada, yada. And people's minds shifted to oh, what are you trying to sell me? Right, if you do that. So knowing when, as part of your total portfolio, when are you doing the brand-led things? When are you doing the company brand-led things? When are you including that sell message or that call to action, and when you're not including that call to action. If you think about Pantene, what they discovered was that, hey, our TV as part of the mix is going to be very inspirational. Our print and digital are going to be more, as you develop that mix, more hard-hitting from product benefits, right? But consumers get it. So don't try to do too much. And again, I can show, I didn't bring them, but we've got spots that we didn't do. We did one that we chose eventually not to air called The Question. And it was really designed to help the Asian American community feel seen and heard. And the question is, well, where are you from? Well, no, where are you really from? Where are you from, right? And the intent that gets laden behind that. And we got up to probably 20 some odd edits of that, and we decided that we did not have the right execution of that, so we're in the process of reshooting that ad, and we'll still release it probably middle of the spring to be able to get back. But it's knowing that when you get it right, you get it right, and when you get it wrong, you've also got to have the courage to say there's something in here that when you can't sleep at night, and when people don't look at that and are brought into it, you got to walk away from the work too.
Okay, so one last question. Yep. I don't get into a coughing spell here. One last question before we open up for Q&A. Which is quite simply, as the person who leads comms at P&G, what is that like for you?
I've been away from my phone for, 35 minutes now. I'm going through withdrawal. So we'll see, but it's good. The good thing about, a global company like P&G is there's always stuff happening somewhere, but it's a dynamic organization, right? So if I think about what I wanted to do with my career, my degree is actually in journalism, and I wanted to be a news reporter. Then I didn't want to be out in 3 feet of snow talking about, wait, it's really cold outside. But it's storytelling, right? And for me, the what gets me out of bed is the ability to connect people with narratives that matter, right? Working in an environment that I think reflects part of who I am from a values and principles standpoint. And being able to have a diversity of experiences over my career. So we've done projects like the work you've seen in my career. I've done them here in the US, I've done them in Europe, I've done them in Asia. And I've worked on everything from, always in Tampax to Tide laundry detergent. This is not what you think you're going to do when you're going to get a journalism degree. And so you're going to work on laundry. You're like, what's exciting about laundry? Big business, I'll tell you. But what I would say is just being able to combine and integrate personal areas of passion with real deep business challenges. The thing I've enjoyed about the communication space is I don't think about myself as a communications guy. I think about myself as a business leader with an expertise in communications, right? So how can we create impact? How do we, create marketplace value, but by doing the right thing and communicating it really well? And that really goes with, the art and science that they go to the Medill website. I'm like, it's the art and science of communicating. It's art and science, right? Because there's a lot of this that we can say you can test till the cows come home. Part of the value that I bring to the C-suite at P&G is I'm connected to the external world. I'm willing to see the company and help others see the company not the way we want them to see it, but to see it as the way it really is, right? So bringing that external point of view into the decision-making room to help shape the company's decisions so that we can get to a good place, so that when it's time to communicate something, we've got something good to communicate. And I, as an individual, feel very proud to stand up and say to do that. I can't imagine being in a company trying to, whitewash, greenwash, pinkwash, whatever it is, what's going on, when you know damn well that, this really ain't that good, right? So that's what kind of keeps me going.
Thank you for sharing that. I'm biased, but I absolutely think that your successor is in this room. So.
We're recruiting. Talk to me afterwards.
All right, thank you for that, Damon. So let's open it up for some questions. Oh, sure.
Thank you. I fell down on my assignment. I didn't properly introduce Mr. Jones. So, would you actually trace, I have a request and a question. The request is, would you sort of trace the arc of your career for us? How did you get to this role? Tell us a little about that. And the question is, at a time when millennials are unplugged and people are not looking at traditional media, how do you think about the platforms on which you're going to present these messages and effectiveness?
Let me start with a question, and then I'll come back to that. TV is still a very powerful medium. And what I'd encourage people to think about is not how people move from X into Y, but make that an and not an or, right? Because what we finding from we call it an advertising space, from a communication space, is each of those has a role. Even when you look at digital, right? If I could pull up a campaign and show an execution on YouTube, on TikTok, and on Twitter, or on Instagram, dramatically different. So I'll take some of the campaigns, right? In the campaigns that we've talked about, the most toxic conversation is on YouTube, right? And why is that? It's because you get to be anonymous and say whatever the heck you want to say on YouTube without any attribution. So people who get their jollies from being, provocative can go to YouTube and express themselves. Twitter, again, still diversity of views, but because people know who you are most of the time, there's a little bit more attribution that helps us understand the context in which people are communicating. Again, what we were able to trace back in the Gillette campaign was that there were groups of people. I could show you this map of people that there was already a group that was railing against toxic masculinity in the tone and tenor of their conversation, and therefore we just kind of put the ball on the tee for them to knock it out. So each of them play a very different role. When people go to Instagram, they go to Instagram and TikTok to feel good. You want to laugh, you want to smile, you want to like stuff when you're there. So really clearly understanding the roles of each of those social channels versus when people are willing to do a little bit more long-form reading, people are willing to click through on Facebook to an article more than they are on any other things, right? So what I'd say is understanding for different consumer groups how they use the mechanisms is important. If I were to say broad generalities, we are forced to be more creative, more visual, and get to the point very quickly. At P&G, I was trained in the school of how do you develop the perfect 60-second ad, right? You need to start by establishing common, so you see, a mother and a nice family table. Then you need to show me the problem. Insert dirty spot on kids' clothes. You need to give me a side-by-side demo, right? Clean, dirty. Then you need to give me a reason to believe there are colorful molecules coming in and picking up the dirt and making them float away. Once you understand the science of that, you kind of say, okay, these are the core elements. Really hard to do in 10 seconds or 13 seconds, which is, the amount of time people are going to spend on a commercial message or Instagram, right? So that puts an importance on really making sure that you establish a human connection with the brand and that is built over a body of evidence. So none of these things work on their own, because when you just see that Pantene ad that one time, that's nice. But when you see that and then you see, wait a minute, they've got a variety of people in their advertising. When you look up and, next time you watch a commercial for Dawn or Swiffer, wait a minute, there are men and they're doing the housework, right? You begin to see all of those things, even subconsciously you begin to make some of those connections. So that's how I'd address the question of how we're thinking about them differently. But my career, I went to Xavier in Cincinnati, got my degree in journalism, started with P&G right out of college, working on Tide and Downy. And I thought I would, ironically, go do that and then go back and either go to journalism school or go to business school, and then figured out I like making money in the world and I was having a lot of fun. So never quite went back for the deferred admission opportunity, but really worked through a variety of positions, all in communications or communications-related field, whether that was working on a brand, working for the enterprise in a geography. I led communications for a mergers and acquisitions group, which was fun, very short-term thinking there, and then got the opportunity to travel, right? So I spent 5 years in Europe between Geneva and London, working in those offices, doing product marketing campaigns. Took a year off at the time and worked on then Senator Obama's first presidential campaign. So I was the communications director for the Democratic National Convention in 2008. And yes, politicians are big brands that you apply a lot of the very same fundamentals to of how you apply brands. Figured out that I loved campaigns. Did not love working for the government. Just was not quite the aspirational thing. So I said, call me again in 4 years, I'll come back and help, which I did. And then really did that, and then just worked through a variety of brands, moved to Boston, worked on our Gillette business, went over to Asia for a number of years, and worked in our overseas business there, leading communications for the Asia Pacific region. And it really gave me an insight into while people are more similar than you might think, yes, there are cultural nuances and yes, there are cultural practices, but if you can tap into the insights of people wanting to be their best selves, people wanting to show their best selves, people wanting to have a positive impact on society and communities, you can combine that with a little bit of cultural relevance and hopefully make some magic around the world. And then in the past 5 years, I've been back in our corporate headquarters doing a lot of investor communications. And as our chief communications officer, when something doesn't go well, my job is to try to go figure out how do we get there and how do we fix it. So thank you.
No other questions?
Here, Candy.
Thank you. In the past year, companies have been asked to declare themselves via state rules, such as voting rights, et cetera, which seems a little different than making an advertisement. How do you think about values that seem to be more driven by ideology?
Thank you for the question. And it's interesting that we've seen such a evolution even within the past few years, right? And so how companies engage in politics, and frankly, as a communications professional, how do I steward that? Is number one, I say is I try to make sure that we are speaking for ourselves on topics and issues that we have earned a right to have a conversation about. Examples. The Trump travel ban, right? And I told you I already work for the Democratic National Committee, so you can imagine where my politics are, right? I'll make this apolitical. The Trump travel ban, right, and how you do that. We're a global company, 100,000 employees around the world. When people are afraid that if they go home and see their relatives and they can't come back to the country to see their family, that's not a political issue. That's a human issue. And so when we advocate for some of these things, we ground it in why it is important. It's important in our ability to serve consumers. It's important in our ability to stand up for the people who come to work for us every day. Voting rights. We believe votes are sacred, right? I'm not going to litigate the Georgia legislation versus the Texas legislation versus what's making its way through the Ohio House. What do we believe? We believe everyone should be able to vote, which is why we give people time off to vote. We believe everyone should be an educated voter, which is why we fight against mis and disinformation. And we believe that every vote should be counted and respected, which is why we believe there needs to be open, equal, and fair access to the polls. That's not a Republican issue. It's not a Democratic issue. So what it means is we don't sign on to every letter that corporate America likes to say, oh, we're part of this coalition. We stand up and we speak for ourselves. And you go to our website and you say, okay, do you believe that or do you believe that? Let me tell you what I believe. And so strategy number one is articulate for yourself. Number two, have a why, right? We're not out there chasing every issue just to do it. And we're not out there, chasing equality for every single thing, right? We are looking at in the industries where it matters the most, where we can have an impact. We're going to make sure that the advertising industry is equal. Why? Because we're the biggest advertiser. And if we say it, we can actually move the industry. I don't know about equality within higher education, so I'm not coming to Northwestern to tell you how to run your business. I'm going to tell you about what are the students that we'd like to hire, right? What do we think are the good things and the skills and capabilities that we believe are going to grow the next generation of great communicators? So I say being really grounded and staying in our lane, but making sure that when we do weigh into it, it's something we've earned the right to participate in because we've put our money where our mouth is and we really do have some actions behind it.
Other questions? Got about 5 minutes.
Hi, thank you so much for being here. I have 2 questions. One would be, what's like the biggest challenge that P&G has right now in communications terms? And the other, what advice would you give to someone who's like going right now out to the world after finish their degree? Thank you.
Good questions. Our biggest challenge constantly is understanding the context of what our consumers are going through so that we can speak to them in a relevant way, right? So if you thought about, I'll use the voting rights issue, right? Like there's a context in what people are talking about today, then there's a context in what it's going to be 3 months from now. The only thing that I know is it's going to be different in 3 months from now. And so making sure that we do as much listening as we do communicating is a really big challenge for us. The second one that I throw in terms of a challenge is the degree of global connectedness that exists around the world. And it's really hard, right? Because there are, I'll give you an example. If you look at the Pantene film that we did a while ago, there are still countries in the world where it's illegal to marry the person you love, or you can't be out, right? And so when you see a global brand doing that, we could have people in certain Middle Eastern or certain African countries who don't want to run that spot, right? And who will look at that and say, oh my gosh, take this off the shelf. I don't want this in my store. So balancing all of those needs and being able to be true and authentic as to what we're doing in one part of the world when the insights are also very different. Another example, in certain parts of the world, we market creams that give you a fair skin tone. They're called whitening creams, right? And if you go back and understand the history of some of that, there's a very different history of how those creams came to be in Africa. It's a very different history in how those creams came to be in Japan or China, right? So we have a huge, more than multi-million-dollar business in whitening creams in Asia. In the U.S. last summer, whitening creams, how dare you, right? How are you telling me my black is not beautiful and you're out here marketing whitening creams? Well, how do I speak authentically to that Japanese or that Korean or that Chinese consumer who has a benefit for a reason that they determine for themselves that they want, while not being inauthentic to people in this country or in Africa who say, you're trying to whitewash that. So really getting that right and being able to have that conversation in a world that is hyper-connected is probably the big challenge, because people will always try to find a reason. And there's not a lot of trust in big companies, frankly, right? I mean, if it's a big company, it must be bad, right? So that's a big thing that I would do. To your question on what advice that I would give someone, is, two things. One specific to this industry is become an expert at your craft, a really good expert at your craft, but be grounded in the business or the industry or the topics that you want to work in, right? I can't be effective if I don't understand what makes P&G money, what industry that we're in, what are the consumer motivations. So yes, while my craft may be storytelling or connecting, unless I'm really grounded in understanding the business, I can't be an effective communicator or counselor, because people always think that they can communicate something better than I can. So again, it's always a little battle there, but really being grounded. The second one I would say is more general, no matter what field you're entering into, is be open to feedback, right? Some of the most constructive experiences that I've had, particularly early in my career, where someone was able to pull you in a room and say, let me talk to you about something that I'm seeing, right? And I had a choice to say, well, what the hell do you know about what I'm doing? You don't know X, Y, Z. But in that moment, to acknowledge that that person giving me feedback is likely doing it from a good position, to acknowledge it, and then to act on it and to say, hey, I thought about what you told me. Here's what I'm going to do differently. And then to actually put that into practice. And over my career, constantly doing that allows people to come to you and be open to talk about the little things and the big things. In this industry, when you're trying to communicate something, what you do and how you do it both matter equally. And that's not to say that there's a dominant style or a right way to doing that, but being able to read a room and understand that you're giving a presentation and half the people have their phones down, you've lost them, right? To understand how not to do death by PowerPoint, all of those things, but being able to understand how to relate, how to understand and how to get feedback from people constantly throughout your career is, I think, going to really put you in a good position, because wherever you start, you're going to learn. And the more you can learn those mistakes so that you don't repeat them often, I think is going to be really important for your success.
Yeah. All right.
Thank you for your wonderful speech, and it's really my honor to hear all the stuff you just told us. And here's my question. So it is interesting for me that not all the ads are like made in the narrative of a CPG product or a CPG brand. So what makes P&G different perceptually when this brand is talking about social issues compared to other brands in maybe other industries talking about the same issue?
It's a great question. What I would say is not everything we do, and this will sound sacrilegious coming from an advertiser, is meant to be totally distinctive. I actually take it as a badge of honor when other companies begin to emulate some of the things that we're doing, because it is accretive in society, and frankly, it will help the receptivity of it. Now, if it was a Tide commercial, I'd probably feel a little bit different. So what I would say is, I think we look at the total body of evidence of the things that we're doing. The ads, the type of ads that you saw tonight, are less than 10% of our total advertising budget. The majority of the advertising that we do is still benefit, insight, relevance driven, right? But they're complemented and they're connected in a way that 1 + 1 = 3, if you will, that I would say. So that's a little bit of how we think about it. And again, our goal is to give you enough reminders over the course of time that you stick with our brands over time. And you, when you got a question, again, does the product work? Is it a good value? Those are the first two things that matter when you're buying any product, right? Beyond that, geez, everything's $3.99 or it's $3 everything like that's not a big difference. What else matters? And in that positive moment, geez, wow, I remember Gillette, they stood up for that, bam. And you don't oftentimes realize. It's why people say intuitively, oh, celebrity endorsements really don't matter. Really? They don't matter, because we don't like to believe that they matter, but companies are still doing it because it's still, look at Instagram or whatever it is, it still does matter. So I think just really understanding what the end game is and what the motivation is, and where it needs to be distinctive, it absolutely is, but where it needs to speak to the individual consumer and resonate with them. If you get them, once a consumer really feels seen, feels heard, and feels recognized, they are also willing to pay a little bit more. Right? P&G products are not the cheapest products on the shelf, right? We're generally the number 1 or 2 brand. We're probably the number 1 or 2 price brand, but we're also the number 1 or 2 performing brand. So when you say good value, good performance, and they, understand me as a consumer, that's what drives, longevity for us as a company.
Damon, I want to say thank you.
It's time already?
It's time.
All right. Can I share one more closing thought? And I'll share with you a final piece of creative. Because a couple of the questions, and one of the questions, Professor Bell, that you asked was, to what end, right? And the 3 pieces of creative that I've shown you really were about individual call to actions in individuals. We've recently created a program called Widen the Screen, and I talked about us wanting to shift the narrative of what we see. And this is a program that we're doing. I'm frankly just out in LA meeting with a number of the film houses that are going to work on this with us. But that's designed to really get at, when we get diversity right behind the camera, how it can impact what we are seeing. And I think that this is important whether you're creating advertising or whether you have diversity in newsrooms, is because it's important that we are showing people authentically. So day in and day out, what I want you to pay attention to is when you're watching commercials, and I'll use TV advertising as this, is who do you see in them, right? Do you see people that reflect the country, but not just how do you get, variety of faces? What are the stories that you're seeing when you see that, right? Because early in our journey, we simplified diversity to say, well, we need to look at the percentage of Black actors or percentage of Hispanic actors or the percentage of actors you can't tell where they're from in our advertising, right? But that was not successful on many of our brands, because if you don't have an authentic cultural insight, you're just being very performative. So this last film that I'll share with you is an effort designed to start us on that journey.
If you've seen this before, if you think you know what happens next, ask yourself why. These are the Black stories we've been shown. widen the screen so we can widen our view.
So when you ask to what end, if we can all expect the diversity, but see it not just in the faces, but in the stories, then I think we will have done a good job. So thank you very much.
Thank you for being here.